Imagine being asleep in your home when out of nowhere, FBI agents break down your front door, throw in flashbang grenades, drag you out in handcuffs, and hold your wife at gunpoint, all because they raided the wrong house. Now here's the kicker: when you tried to hold the government accountable for that mistake, the government argues that you can't sue them because their agents had discretion in how they planned and operated that raid. This exact situation went all the way to the United States Supreme Court, and the court handed down a 9-0 unanimous decision that could have big implications for everyone in the country. And now the 11th Circuit just reheard arguments in this case in light of what the Supreme Court just said. So let's talk about what is now developing after those arguments and what's happening in this critical case. Now, before we jump into this video, if you want to support this channel, one of the best ways to do that is simply to subscribe. You can also click the like button that just tells the algorithm that you appreciate this content, and so it shares it with more people. So if you've been following the channel for a while, you will know that the Supreme Court recently issued a 9-0 unanimous ruling in favor of the Martin family, who were victims of an FBI wrong house raid. So this essentially happened back in 2017, where FBI agents executed a pre-dawn raid against this family in a suburban Atlanta area. Instead of going there, an officer used his own personal GPS, so he put the address on the warrant in his GPS, and he claims that the GPS routed him to a completely different home, and so they actually ended up about 3 doors down, but really it was almost a block over, to the home of Katrina Martin, where she lived with her boyfriend and their 7-year-old son. When the FBI agents arrived at the home without warning, they decided to smash in the front door. They detonated flashbang grenades inside the house, pulled out the boyfriend and Katrina Martin, who were hiding in the closet with a shotgun, handcuffed them, pointed guns at them, dragged her out essentially half dressed, and then also pulled out their young child as well. Now, after the agents had detained the family, they did a search of the home, and while doing a search, one of the agents noticed some mail on a coffee table, and he noticed that the address on that mail was different from the address that was supposed to be on the warrant. That's when they kind of had this huge oh crap moment that they raided the wrong home. So they let the family go, told them that they would be back to explain, and then they went essentially 3 homes down and then executed the warrant and the raid against the correct home. In response to this, the family sued the government and they brought a claim under the Federal Tort Claims Act, also known as the FTCA. The government claimed immunity under the discretionary function exception of the FTCA and asserted that this case must be thrown out. Now, on review, the lower courts originally agreed essentially with the FBI and the government, but eventually this made its way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court decided to step in, and ultimately the Supreme Court disagreed with the lower courts. The Supreme Court made something very clear in their 9-0 ruling. You don't automatically get immunity just because law enforcement exercised judgment. The government has to show that those decisions were grounded in actual policy considerations, not just mistakes. Because of this, the Supreme Court sent the case back down to the 11th Circuit to apply the correct standard and to take a clean first look at this case as well. So this case went back down to the 11th Circuit really fast, and the 11th Circuit recently heard oral arguments in this case once again. And this is where things get very interesting. The judges during the arguments focused heavily on one key issue: where is the line between policy discretion and basic operational failures? Throughout the arguments, several judges pressed the government on this exact point. One of the biggest questions was essentially this one here, which is, how can executing a warrant at a wrong address possibly be considered a protected policy decision? The judges seemed very skeptical that something so fundamental, like simply identifying the correct house on a warrant, could fall under discretionary immunity. There were also questions about whether the government's theory would take this too far. So the question was, if this counts as discretion, then what wouldn't? Because under the DOJ's argument, almost any mistake during a law enforcement operation could be reframed as discretionary judgment, and almost anything would be covered. As one of the judges put it during the oral arguments, almost everything involves a person's choice or judgment, and if the government's line is followed, then everything would be covered and everything would be discretion. And that raised serious concerns from the panel here on the 11th Circuit. Now, another key line of questioning focused on the Supreme Court's recent ruling. The judges repeatedly pushed the government to explain how their position was consistent with what the Supreme Court said in that 9-0 unanimous ruling. And the government here really struggled to give the 11th Circuit a clear answer. Now, here's a key update based on what happened after the oral arguments. At the end of the oral arguments, the court there told both sides it would let them know whether it wanted additional briefing on how the Supreme Court's decision impacts the negligence issue that was brought up in the case. And that was one of the main things that we watched for last week. But as of now, we have still not seen or received any order from the 11th Circuit requesting any additional briefing on that issue. And that is a very important signal for this case, because if the court wanted more briefing like they said, they told the parties that they would request that within the next week. But we have not received that yet. We have not gotten an order. So what this likely means and tells us is that it strongly suggests that the court is not going to request additional briefing. And instead, the court is likely moving straight towards deciding this case. So in other words, the judges believe they already have all the information that they need. They don't need more arguments, and they're now working towards the merits decision of this case. During the arguments, the DOJ essentially doubled down on the same position that they presented to the lower court and to the Supreme Court. They claimed that everything leading up to the raid, including surveillance, navigation, and execution, involved discretionary decisions. And because no specific rule dictated exactly, how the agents had to verify the address, they argue that the discretionary function exception still applies. But the judges here did not fully seem to be convinced by that. There was a lot of questions about, what did they actually do to try to ensure that they had the right house. Some of the agents were saying, well, it was dark. The address or the home didn't have the numbers on it. We didn't have enough time to check the mailboxes because we didn't want to give up our position or let them know that we're coming. And so we just thought that this was maybe the right house. It looked right. There was a car that kind of looked right. And so we executed the raid against this home. Now, on the other side, the plaintiffs made a much simpler argument. They told the court this isn't about policy. This is about basic non-discretionary duties. They argue that the FBI has to hit the right house. That's not a judgment call. That's the bare minimum requirement of executing a warrant. And that argument appeared to resonate more clearly with the panel of the 11th Circuit. Now, the biggest takeaway from these arguments is that the judges here on the 11th Circuit did seem very concerned about the consequences of the government's current position. Because if the DOJ wins here, it would effectively mean that wrong house raids are almost always immune from lawsuits. And that would be dramatically expanding upon government immunity and would go far beyond what the Supreme Court has allowed in its precedents. So what does this all suggest about where this case is currently heading? Well, based on the tone of the arguments, there are a couple likely paths. The most likely outcome is that the 11th Circuit rules against the government and allows the Martin's family case to move forward. And also maybe the 11th Circuit here is just going to rule on the merits. That was another thing that they talked about, ruling on the negligence side. So they may say that the FTCA discretionary function exception doesn't apply, but maybe they rule on the state negligence aspect and say, well, this wasn't just outright negligence. They could do that. Specifically, the court may draw also a clear distinction between protected policy decisions and basic operational negligence. And there's also a possibility that the court will just issue a very narrow ruling, not really talk about the limits of the FTCA discretionary function exception, but just saying getting the wrong house on a warrant is a clear error, and just maybe that's as far as they go. Either way, the government appears to be in a much weaker position now than it was before the Supreme Court stepped in. And now with no additional briefing requested, the timeline has likely accelerated towards a final decision. So this case is now at a critical point. We have that 9-0 unanimous ruling from the Supreme Court. We have those new arguments from the 11th Circuit, and there is no additional briefs that have been requested right now from the 11th Circuit. So now it looks like this is moving towards a ruling. So that's what's currently happening in this critical case. As we get more information, as this develops more, I will let you guys know. If you like this video and you'd like to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is simply to like, comment, and subscribe. All of those things help to fuel the algorithm and just tells the algorithm that you appreciate this type of content, and so it shares it with more people. But as always, thank you so much for all of your support. And never forget, this nation was built by armed scholars, and this nation will be maintained by armed scholars.